We are back to example number 2. If you inspect here, click on grid and look at the first item, you'll notice that I have used top, right and bottom margins to add some spaces between the items vertically and horizontally. This is obviously a hacky way to add spaces, and thankfully we have a quick neat solution in grid to add spaces between rows and columns. Let me go back to the code and remove the margins first. Remove, and also remove this padding top on the icon I had added for vertical alignment. To add spaces between columns, we can use the property column gap again on the parent container. Column gap. The value of this is usually in fixed width, like say 2 rem in our case. Let's see what this gives us. Great, we have some gap between the columns. Similarly, for spaces between rows, we add the row gap, again 2 rem. Exactly same as before, but much better because we don't have to calculate and add margins and paddings to individual items. And at the same time, with these gap properties, we only end up with spaces between the rows and columns and not around them. Back to the code. These two rules can be combined into a single one by using the shorthand gap property, where the first value is the row gap, 2 rem, and the second value is the column gap. These two values are separated by spaces. And when both these values are the same, you can even combine them into one single value, just 2 rem in our case. Let's check. Nothing changes. Perfect. Now this was about adding spaces when the combined size of all cells add up to the size of the container. Consider this next example of a shopping cart summary. This is a grid with 4 columns and 2 rows. All the columns have auto sizing, and since the combined column widths are smaller than the parent container, the remaining space has been distributed to the auto columns by default. Inspect element to understand better. On grid, you can see that each column has some additional space to the right. Let's look at the code for this. Here's the markup, a description div, quantity and the price. Here are the styles, but the one with respect to grid are here. Grid template columns has auto repeated 4 times because we need 4 columns all auto sized based on content. And here some row and column gap that you can see when you inspect. Now what we want to do is not divide that extra space and add into each column. Instead, use that space to spread out the columns with the first column at the extreme left and the last column at the extreme right, occupying only as much space as needed. To control the spacing of columns in grid, we use the CSS property justify content. If you know Flexbox, you must be familiar with this property and the values too. The value that we need in our case is, let's see what this gives us. There we go. Now all the columns occupy only as much space as the content within, and the additional space has been distributed into gaps. Some of the other values of this property are start, where all the columns stack up at the beginning, end, where all the columns stack up towards the end, center, where all the columns stack up in the middle, space around, where the gaps on the left and the right are half as much as the gaps in between, and lastly, evenly, where the gaps around and the gaps in between the columns are same. But the most commonly used values are either center or space between, like we need in this case. Note that this property justify content only works when the column widths don't add up to the parent width. So even if you have one column with the FR unit, for example, if we change this to auto, 1FR, auto and auto, this property has no effect because all the additional space is now occupied by the column with the FR unit. Let's change it back. This was about controlling spaces between columns. How about rows? So let's try and add a height here. Let's say height 24 rem, and let's see what happens. Inspect. We did not specify any height to our rows, but by default the rows take up auto height, and that's why, like our columns got stretched to occupy full width, our rows also get stretched to occupy full height. We saw a similar behavior when we were implementing the header, footer and main section, right? To make the rows occupy only as much height as the content within and to control the spacing between them, we use the property align content. For columns, it's justify content, and for rows, it's align content. And the available values are same as that of the justify content. So let's go with start first. This is what we get. The rows are stacked up at the beginning. You can use end, center, space between, space around, and space evenly. And the default value being stretch. That's what we saw in the beginning. So let me change this to center. Quick summary of what we learned. To add fixed width spaces between columns and rows, we can use the properties column gap, row gap, or simply the shorthand gap. To add spaces between columns when the parent has additional width available, you can use the justify content property. Similarly, to add spaces between rows when the parent has additional height available, you can use the align content property. And there's one more property that can be used as a shorthand property combining these two, which is place content, where the first value is the align content value. So in our case, it would be start or center, and then the justify content value, which is space between. Let's see if this works. And yes, it gives us the same output.